The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and rich in love. The Lord is good to all. He has compassion on all he has made. The Lord upholds those who fall and lifts up all who are bowed down. The eyes of all look to you, and you give them their food at the proper time. You open your hand and satisfy the desires of every living thing. The Lord is righteous in all his ways and loving towards all he has made. The Lord is near to all who call on him in truth. He fulfills the desires of those who fear him. He hears their cry and saves them. The Lord watches over all who love him, but all the wicked he will destroy. My mouth will speak in the praise of the Lord. Let every creature praise his holy name forever and ever. Next reading is from Genesis, chapter 32, verse 22 through 31. That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with man and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon.
Good morning. So, for anyone who's new, welcome to Mendon Church, who hasn't been here before, and thank you all for putting up with me, I guess, today, since Pastor Hodong is on hiatus. Hopefully he's having a good time getting refreshed for next week when he's got to pick up the pieces. Yeah, I don't know about you, but I think no one would really have to tell me not to eat this tendon thing that attaches to a hip. I'm okay with that, right? They can keep that. That's like commandment number 11, don't eat tendon things. So we have a wrestling match, right? Elizabeth talked about it a little bit. We got a wrestling match. And when, you got all different kinds of wrestling. She talked about the WWE and stuff, and I started to think about, before a wrestling match that's on TV or even some of the other, combat sports or whatever, they have the thing called the tail of the tape, right? So, I tried to imagine what the tail of the tape would be for this wrestling match. I mean, think about it. You've got Jacob, right? For all intents and purposes, we don't know his dimensions, but he's probably an average human, right? So we try to imagine an average. Greg, can you stand up? So he's a pretty average guy, right? Looks pretty fit. He's got your average, it's we won't ask you your age, but usually the tail of the tape will tell the age and the height and the weight and the reach and the record of the person, right? So they announce that, and the announcer's going to say, and here we have in this corner, Greg, the average person, right? And they also tell, the name of the person, and it would have nicknames. But, in Jacob's corner, what would they say? And here we have Jacob, deceiver, scammer, sneaky guy, right? That's what his name meant. And in this corner, we have God, right? So what's the tail of the tape on God? Well, his age is before time began. His height, weight, reach is beyond our imagination, infinite, right? And his record is undefeated. Really kind of stinks to be Jacob, right? So I was looking at this passage, and it kind of reminded me of, did you ever watch the TV shows where at the very beginning of the show, they show you this scene where, like, usually it's like one of the main people in the show is in this precarious position or like a really awkward situation and things like that, and you're like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And they freeze the frame and they go, 6 months earlier, and you're like, crud. Now I got to wait the whole show to find out what's going to happen next, right? My wife hates that. But it kind of reminded me of that, because really what we have is just the wrestling match and all that stuff, but we don't know where it came from. We don't know why they're wrestling. So I thought I'd just kind of rewind and kind of figure out where that came from. If we look, and in my rewinding, I really discovered something that I hadn't realized before, but Jacob, we know Jacob's pretty significant in the Bible, but if we look at the amount of time spent on Jacob, it's really significant. Like, you look from creation to Babel was 11 chapters, right? Abraham, father of nations, he got 14 chapters. Isaac, Jacob's father, and Ishmael, they both got less than a chapter in terms of their thing. But Jacob got 10 chapters. Right before Joseph got 13, so this must be pretty significant. Thing to understand about Jacob that kind of helps us understand Jacob in his later life and where he's at when he starts to wrestle with God is that his family is kind of dysfunctional. And it sort of influenced the way that Jacob, his relationships with other people and with God. You look at his father, one of the commentators called his father just somebody who's he's in passive acceptance to life. It was very customary to tell stories in the Bible and in their culture about how a person found their wife. Well, Isaac just sent a servant out to find a wife for him, and he would just accept whoever she came back with. Even if you look at, like, early in his life, he accepted that he may have to be the sacrifice for Abraham. And God took care of that and made sure it didn't happen, but he just accepted it. There was no real struggle there, which is kind of a good thing that he was accepting God's will, but at the same time, it shows more about his nature. And even later on, we'll learn a little bit about the deception, and like, in reality, like, he mistook goat hair for his son. Like, so I think he kind of was also in that case accepting the situation and not really looking to dig deeper into it. His mother, Rebecca, who was partial to Jacob, she got this premonition from God, right? She got visited by God, and God said, you're going to have 2 sons, and they're going to be the fathers of nations, and one's going to be stronger, and the older's going to serve the younger. And this was a pretty significant thing to have a message from God, right? So who did she tell about it? Well, nobody right away. She never told Isaac, because Isaac would have been a little bit clued in as he was raising his sons, right, to what God wanted to happen. She eventually, I believe, told Jacob about it, because we'll see in Jacob's actions, but she didn't. She was really, if you look at her character, she was kind of controlling and manipulative, and really, it may have been out of necessity, because her father didn't really play a big role in her life. Her brother actually arranged for her marriage and things like that, but at any rate, she was kind of sneaky herself, right? He had a brother, Esau, who was a hunter, which a lot of times, I'll be honest, like, I used to read that as, okay, that's probably a compliment. He's a first brother, he's a hunter, he's strong, he goes out there and he serves the fields and things like that. But Henry Morris pointed out that actually in the situation that Jacob and Esau were in, hunting wasn't necessary. It was more of a recreational type activity. They had a huge flock. And in a huge flock, you didn't need to go out and spend your time hunting for meat. They used what they had. So he was always hunting. We also know that he was very impulsive from what happened later, right? He was like, if you give me a bowl of stew, I will give you my inheritance. Like for a bowl of stew. And beyond that, later on, we also learn that he didn't really take his inheritance, his birthright all that seriously, obviously, but he also didn't really take his word that seriously, because eventually he tried to get that blessing that he had already promised to Jacob. So, and then there was Jacob, right? Now, Jacob didn't start off great. He obviously, we talked about a little bit about his family, but think about it, like, they named him Deceiver. And to us, Jacob sounds okay. And in our culture, like, we can name people Jacob and things, and it does have that meaning, but it's kind of like a secondary thing. But in their culture, like, they said, oh, who's that guy? Well, he's very Jacob. He's very deceiving. Like, they actually use the word. So, like, that'd be like, you have a kid tomorrow, and you're like, oh, I think I'll name him Deceiver. I think I'll name this other kid Sneaky Guy. Like, that wasn't very nice. So he had a mom and dad who don't communicate. Mom tells him about the favor of God, but doesn't tell anybody else. He was named Deceiver, so he really wasn't set up for success. And let's see how it kind of went. We'll try to go through fairly quickly so we can get to the passage here, but he got the case of the stolen birthright. He tricks Esau, right? I mean, he was aware of the promise and the blessing, but he wasn't patient enough, and he wasn't trusting enough of God, so he really was very impatient and self-reliant. And on top of that, once he gets that blessing from Esau, who did he tell? Well, nobody, right? He didn't even tell his mom, who obviously communicates with him and favors him, because she then thought the next thing that was going to happen is that she thought she still had to trick Isaac into giving Jacob the blessing. So the next thing is Rebekah and Jacob, they conspire to trick Isaac. Isaac sends Esau off. Rebekah tells Jacob to go deceive Isaac. Isaac blesses Jacob. Esau comes back again, even though he knows he's already given up this blessing and tries to get the blessing from his father. And then Rebekah warns Jacob, and she gets Isaac to send Jacob away, right, so that he'll be safe. And coincidentally, this son that was her favorite, she actually never gets to see him again after that. So Jacob's off, right? So God comes to Jacob in a dream, and Jacob, in his infinite wisdom, God says, I'm going to promise you all these nations, and I'm going to give you all this stuff. And Jacob says, cool, I'm going to take off. I'm going to leave this. Like, it didn't really make any sense, right? Like, Jacob's just going to flee the land, even though God came to him in a dream and said, I'm promising you this. So again, he didn't trust God, and he trusted in his own self to flee and go make a home. He meets Laban, and he and Laban are peas of the same pod, right? Because Laban's a scammer himself. He meets Laban, and he says, okay, if I work for 7 years, will you give me Rachel? He says, oh, sure. And he gets Leah. Oh, sure, you can have another 7 years. And then he gets Rachel. And then he works another 6 or 7 years. He builds a flock. And instead of sitting down with them and saying, like, I've married both your daughters, I've helped you build your flock, like, it's time for me to be out on my own, he just sneaks away. So he heads back to meet with Esau. It's like 20 years after everything has happened. And you'd think that maybe he's learned that, okay, God's come to me in a dream, and things aren't necessarily going my way. Maybe I should go back and I should trust God and just see what's going to happen with my blessing, right? And it looks like he's sort of going to do that, except when you look at how he's planning to come back there. Like, if you look just right at the first part of before our passage, his strategy is to bribe him. He's going to send a whole bunch of stuff ahead with his servants to tell him, like, you are the best, Esau, like, I am just coming back to serve you and everything. In the back of his head, he's still thinking that he still wants to come back and get that blessing that he was promised. So then he hears back from his servants that, Esau said, great, but I'm going to come with 400 men. So again, he thinks the worst. He has no idea, but he thinks the worst. And so he's like, all right, I've got to try to control, manipulate the situation again. So he starts to form this backup plan, and he splits everybody up, and he does all this stuff, and he's really giving himself an out, because he's like, I got to self-preserve here. Like, Esau's got 400 men, and they'll wipe us out, kind of thing. He also, comes up with another plan to send more people, and everybody ahead of him. Everybody, you go and make sure that Esau is not going to get me, right? So, and he prays to God, and you think, okay, good. He's praying to God. But his prayer isn't, God, I trust you. I know you've promised all this to me, and I'm going to go forward and go back and reunite with my brother Esau, and I trust that whatever it is your will. He says, you know what, God, help me out. You owe me one. You promised, God. And again, he comes up with the more bribes, and he's in a panic, and that night, here's where our passage kind of comes up. He's in a panic, and he moves his family across the river, and he's going to be alone, and I don't exactly know what he's trying to plan, but he's constantly trying to plan something for his own self-preservation. And then what happens? Well, we have our scene. God says what? Well, in the immortal words of Michael Buffer, God says, let's get ready to rumble. Right? Because before, Jacob did not listen to him. He came in a dream and told him stuff. So now God's going to up the ante and say, you know what? I know you're not going to listen to me, but if you need to wrestle, let's wrestle. Right? I imagine it was pretty startling to him, because all of a sudden in the middle of the night, he's awoken into a wrestling match. Now, some people might say, well, it was a dream and it's not real, but, Jacob's limp was real in the morning, right? So something happened. So, why? Why did God have to come wrestle with Jacob? Well, again, he didn't really listen the first time when God tried to talk to him in a dream. But also, too, Jacob's focus was wrong. All his life, he looked at things, he looked at people and things that were standing in the way of he and the blessing that he was promised from God. He looked at Isaac. He's, I gotta get over on Isaac. I gotta, figure this out, right? Esau standing in the way of my blessing. Laban is, he's scamming me here. Like this is in the way of my blessing. I gotta, get over on that. But God came and struggled with him to show him that actually it wasn't any of that. He was really his obstacle. And a lot of times we can be like that, right? We look at things that are standing in our way. It might be a job, it might be a boss, it might be our parents that are standing in our way. Otherwise, we would be able to receive the blessing that God is, if only I could get that job, then that would be the blessing that God wants for me. Or if only I could do this, or if only I could do that. So, like Elizabeth said, sometimes we wrestle with God too. Why did they have to wrestle all night? You'd think, Jacob wasn't really getting anywhere. You don't hear much about it, but he obviously wasn't really getting anywhere, because at the end, with the flick of his hand, God gave Jacob a limp forever, right? So, to get a little perspective, obviously the Bible oftentimes refers to us as sheep. And we all know sheep are not smart. Andrew Bonner, he was talking about the sheep in the Highlands of Scotland. And what happens is these sheep, they'll wander off. They smell the sweet grass and they wander off, and they kind of get themselves stuck over an embankment, not over the cliff itself, but they're eating the grass and things like that. And so the shepherds have to go rescue them because they can't get back up. They've jumped down, but they can't jump back up. And what the shepherds discovered is if they rush off and they try to rush right down and get that sheep, well, the sheep will then continue to run away. That's the sheep's solution, is to run away. And when they continue to run away, they run right off the cliff. Well, what the shepherds also discovered is if they let that sheep just be there and do what sheep do and eat the grass and, kind of scurry about and worry a little bit, they'll get exhausted. And then eventually, they'll fall down and they'll go to sleep, and the shepherd can then lower himself, and he can grab the sheep, and he can come back up and return the sheep to the flock. That's really why God had to struggle all night with Jacob, because Jacob had to get to the point where there was no more effort that he could put in. And that's why sometimes we have to struggle with God till we're just all out of what we can figure out for God to give us the answer. But even in the struggle, God had to go so far, like it wasn't even, like I imagine that the wrestling match was kind of like when I was a kid. I used to wrestle my dad a lot, and it was kind of a futile effort on my part because my dad was giant and I was little, and my dad was just like, all right, what's on the news and stuff like that. Like, I imagine it was a little bit like that, like God wasn't really struggling, but he wouldn't give up. So God had to give him the physical reminder of his own weakness. And at the same time, it was a reminder to Jacob that you don't have all the outs you used to have. What was Jacob's MO? Esau's mad, I'll run. Laban's going to be mad, so I'm going to skate out of here quick, right? I'm going back to meet Esau, but I'm going to leave myself a back door. Well, now he had a limp. He didn't have any more back doors. But even in all of this, Jacob still didn't quite trust God, right? He still was hanging on, and it might seem like a little bit of, submission to God, and he did understand that he was at his last resort. But his last resort was, he just kind of grabbed on and said, I'm not going to let go, right? So he said, I guess I picture it like this. Like, I'm not going to let go unless you give me the blessing. Well, anybody ever had that kid that said, if you don't give me dessert, I'm going to hold my breath? Exactly. It's funny. But the kid doesn't think it's funny. They think that they're really going to get that dessert somehow. And that's really, Jacob was like, you know what? Like, I'm just going to hold on through my own efforts again. So, the Lord then said, all right, well, we're at the point now where I need to pick him up. I need to lower myself down to that sheep and pick him up. So the Lord picks him up because he's now that exhausted sheep. And he gives him a new name. And what's his new name? Israel, right? Well, a lot of conventional wisdom would say, like, it means he who struggles with God. But I also looked at some other definitions of Israel, and I think I like, for this purpose, for this, this morning's message, I think I like better, he who strives with God. Or he who prevails with God. Because in reality, Jacob he was struggling with God, but he wasn't struggling with God to show that he could struggle with God. Like, he didn't walk away from this and say, see, I battled God. See, look at me. Like, I'm not afraid of God. He didn't leave with that, right? That would be somebody who's not afraid to struggle with God. Everybody struggles with God. But what he came out of it was understanding his weakness and understanding his strength with God. See, a lot of times, if we cling to God in our struggles and our brokenness, it's going to give us power with God. So, and then he went off limping, right, to meet Esau. Here's a neat thing, too. He went off, and who went before him when he went off? Nobody. He went off limping, and he went in front of all those plans. He just threw those out the window, and he was like, all right, God, that's fine. I'm all in. I'm just going to go meet Esau, and I'm going to trust you on this one. And in that limping off, in his weakness, he limped off. But because he had God's strength, he was actually stronger in that moment. And he was able to grow into and live into his blessing and understand his blessing more so than he ever had throughout his life. So what can we learn from Jacob? Well, I think the first thing that we can learn, right, is to take time with God. We saw how Jacob's life went when he didn't take time to spend with God. Now, Jacob, we don't see places where he communicated with his father other than deceiving him. So we don't really see that he had that kind of relationship with his father. So maybe that's kind of how he formulated his relationship with God, was not to really communicate and to kind of live his life and go under his own power. Probably not a lot different than a lot of us. We don't really share as much with God as we should. And also, I would say, under that same category, I would say don't procrastinate taking time to spend with God. Because what happened when Jacob procrastinated? That was pretty painful, right? So, when and how do I take time to spend with God? Well, I'll tell you the same thing that I tell patients when I go at Strong or at Unity when I do my work as a chaplain. They say, I don't know how to pray. I don't know how to talk to God. Am I supposed to do it at night? Am I supposed to do it in the morning? What am I supposed to say? I don't know any prayers. And I say, you know what? You just need to talk to him whenever you need to and however you need to. And sometimes you're going to be happy to talk to God, but sometimes you're going to be hurt. And sometimes you're going to be mad. And sometimes you're going to be confused. And you know what? I say, God wants all that too. And that's really all that God wanted all along from Jacob, was him to communicate and share so that he could guide him along to his blessing. And eventually it took the wrestling match for Jacob to kind of realize that. So I would say that to all you. And the analogy I use with the patients that I visit in the hospital is that, if you take the person that you care about most in life, right? And if they're upset with you, do you want them to turn their back and go the other way? Or do you want them to turn around and talk to you about it? Whether they're really mad or upset or hurt? Well, I don't know about all you, but I don't ever want somebody I love to turn away from me and run away. I know I'm not perfect, and I know I do things that make them angry, and I do things that hurt them, and I don't really mean to do it a lot of the time, but it happens. But I don't ever want them to run away and know that I don't love them, right? And that's how God feels. So take time with God and take time to communicate all the things that you need to communicate with God. The good and the bad, the joys and the sorrows. The second thing we can learn through this struggle with Jacob is, Jacob all his life thought he was struggling with a lot of things that he really wasn't struggling with. And who was he really struggling with? Himself. So take a minute when you're struggling to ask yourself who you're really struggling with. Are you struggling with the boss, the parent, the friend, the spouse? Or are you struggling with yourself and your obstacle to trusting God? The more we can learn to understand about ourselves, the more it leads us to understanding and appreciating God's blessings in our life. Why did God ask Jacob his name? He knew his name, right? Because when God asked Jacob his name, Jacob had to say it out loud in front of God so he would understand his nature. But also, not so that he would understand his nature and feel bad about it, but so that he would understand that, you know what? Part of his human nature is that he is a deceiver, and he is a planner and a schemer, and sometimes that's good and sometimes that's not so good, but that regardless of who is and what he was named, he is still accepted and loved in the face of God. And God needed him to understand that was not his legacy, that was not his blessing, wasn't to be Jacob deceiver, Jacob, you're on your own, Jacob, you're going to struggle. It was, Jacob, I got a plan for you. And the third thing, and maybe the most important thing that we can learn from Jacob, is trust. There was an airplane ride, a flight. It took off, Everybody hopped on like normal, and they read their books, and they were doing their thing. And halfway through, they started to encounter some turbulence. And this guy in the ride, he's like, oh my gosh, he started to get a little worried, and he looked around, and the people seemed to be a little worried, kind of thing. And then it started to get worse and worse and worse and worse. And as he looked around, like even the oxygen thing started to pop down, and the plane's going up and down and dropping, and people are getting sick, and it's kind of crazy. And he's looking around, and he's like, oh my gosh, like people are praying, and people are, crying, and all kinds of stuff's going on. And then he looks over his shoulder, and he happens to notice there's a little girl. And she's just sitting there like nothing's going on. She's reading a book. Legs crossed under the seat, flipping the pages, in her own world. No headphones, so she was quite aware, and there's no way you couldn't be aware of what was going on the plane. Well, they worked through all that turbulence, and eventually they landed, and everybody was very relieved, and the man was curious, so, after the flight, he politely went up to the girl, and he said, that was a rough flight. I mean, everybody was panicking. I was praying and, wishing I had a rosary, and, I don't even know, but, I looked, and, you were just sitting there reading your book. He said, I don't understand how you could be that calm, that you could just continue to read the book in the middle of all that. And she said, well, it's pretty simple, sir. My dad's the pilot, and he was taking me home. That's the kind of trust that God wants us to be able to have in Him. That He's the pilot. He's guiding our life, and He's going to get us where we need to go. He's going to get us there safely. And it might be scary sometimes, and there might be some turbulence, and there might be all kinds of stuff going on. But in the middle of all that, we can rest assured that God's promises are good. So, this little devotional I read, most days, some days, but I just happened to read it today, and it's kind of interesting how God works, where He kind of brings everything into a whole, and everything kind of fits. And you have those moments, and they say there's no accidents. I think there's just more like God moments. So I'm sitting there going over my sermon last night, and I'm like, I wonder what this says for today, meaning today. And it says, when things seem to be going all wrong, stop and affirm your trust in me. Calmly bring those matters to me and leave them in my capable hands. Then simply do the next thing. Stay in touch with me through thankful, trusting prayers, resting in my sovereign control. Rejoice in me, exult in the God of your salvation as you trust in me. And make your feet like the feet of deer. I make your feet like the feet of deer. I enable you to walk and make progress upon your high places of trouble, suffering, and responsibility. Trust in God. That was the message I worked on all week. And I didn't read it all week, and all of a sudden I pick it up, and there it was. I talked a couple of weeks ago in the children's sermon about the passage from Jeremiah. For I know the plans I have for you, plans for good, to prosper, so you have hope, so you have a future. That's what God has for us. But what we have to do is we have to trust, right? Now, if y'all join me in a word of prayer. Loving God, we thank you so much for all that you do in our lives. We thank you for the message that you have for us this morning. Lord, we just ask that you give us strength as we go forward in our lives, courage to trust in you. And we ask these blessings in Jesus' name. Amen.